Today we'll be talking about Yakuza Kenzan, a Yakuza spin-off game set in the Edo period that never came out to the West. And this will not so much be a traditional review, but more of a review of my experience with this game in Japanese, since it just wouldn't be fair to rate it along the other games I review given I can't read any Japanese. So let's start with the story, the part I can't understand. Initially, I was going to start with the gameplay, but as I started writing, I realized most of the gameplay is justified by the story, even if you don't understand the actual plot going on. For starters, of course, the game takes place in the Edo period, that meaning the 1600s, and with that being much more focused on samurais and their combat. In this case, being inspired by the story of Miyamoto Musashi, where Kazuma, here playing a character of Musashi himself, and it's weird, there are multiple characters here from other Yakuza games, but with completely different names or very similar names. But regardless, usually they are derivative of other characters from Musashi's novel. For example, Majima here, still called Majima, is clearly supposed to represent Baiken Shishido with his chain and sickle. That being said, I believe this doesn't really follow any actual arc of Musashi's story that I'm aware of at least. It's a bit hard with the language barrier and my limited knowledge of Musashi's story, given most of my knowledge comes from having read the manga Vagabond, which is an adaptation of the novel. But even with all of those barriers, it's still curious to see this is a Yakuza story, with its usual tropes, with Kazuma being resistant to starting the action of the game and Haruka being kidnapped. The best way I found to put it is if the Yakuza writers had written Musashi. Overall, I can't really give my opinion on it, but it seemed again very Yakuza like, and it's entertaining in that way. For me at least, it was fun trying to figure out who each character was representing in the story. So now we'll talk about the gameplay and also how did I go about playing this game. I guess for starters, video games, as diverse as they can also be very similar. Conventions of the genres and just overall systems that are so ingrained in the medium that any gamer can pick up on regardless of the language. Things like button prompts and minimap waypoints. But Kenzan is not like your typical Yakuza beat 'em up, or at least typical at the time of release of this game with samurai type fighting. And during the gameplay, that translates to four styles of combat options. You have your main blade for your more traditional one on one samurai fighting, then we have the long heavy sword, which is a lot slower but a lot more powerful. But in practice, it's used mostly to break barriers in certain areas, and in actual combats, it's only really used for crowd control given the area of effect, but it's just a bit too slow to be used on its own. Then we have the two-handed swords, of course inspired by Musashi's own style of dual wielding, and this gameplay wise is a jack of all trades, because with its higher speed than any of the other techniques, it means it's both useful in one-on-one combats and also when fighting multiple enemies. Then we have our fourth and most useless one as being your fist. It has really no advantages to it over the other methods, with its much shorter range and low attack power, and you should never use it unless you're forced to, which will be the case at the beginning of the game. Something all these modes of combat have in common though is their simplicity, with their main attack having a simple combo with light and heavy attacks. Then we have a dodge and a block, very similar to other Yakuza games. Here, where it differs from other games in the series is where you used to have the grab button, here we have a block breaker, which is a bit poorly designed in my opinion, as this move should allow you to link and make combo chains, given that most enemies will block after being hit by a full combo. But they also have a tendency of being pushed back after said combo, which makes me think that this was an intentional thing, which I personally don't really get since I feel it makes the combat just much slower, which to be fair could have been the developer's intent, but regardless, combat feels sluggish and overly simple. There isn't even a leveling tree here, each level just adding to the health bar and heat action bar, and of course, the occasional heat action itself. Heat actions here are okay, they definitely lack the flashiness of later entries in the franchise and end up feeling just as simple as the combat. Gameplay just isn't quite there isn't enough to hook you in, and it's made worse by the lack of minigames that are such a staple of the series. I personally didn't really find any besides the gambling ones and the melon slicing one that's very similar to the baseball minigame of the main series, but again, with the language barrier, there could be more there, and I just don't know. There are still side missions though. Problem again, side missions to me are very hinged on them being usually very intriguing or comedic with its writing, and well, of course, I can't really enjoy any of that here, so fair to say I mostly avoided them. The gameplay overall, regardless, just feels overly simplistic, and when you put it into perspective, other things with the development and timing of this game start to make sense, as I will address that now in the graphics and more technical department. Kenzan is an early PS3 game, no doubt about it. Very pasty skin textures, which in the main characters actually doesn't look that bad, but in any NPC it's very much PS2 levels of detail, and with a very bland color palette that I have to imagine came from a search for realism after the big jump that happened between the PS2 and the PS3. And while it's not without its moments, for example, there is this fight in tall grass during sunset and it looks great despite the dated graphics. I think good art direction can really make a game age gracefully, regardless of the technology, but unfortunately Kenzan is more often generic than it is not. This was less of a problem when the PS3 was a new console and these were shiny new graphics of course, but time has not been so nice. Here locations and paths are big but there's not much to do. There's something that is good though about this location, is something I'll never really mention but all Yakuza games do really well, is crowds, something that makes Yakuza maps a lot more alive and feel like they're lived in. And thankfully the same applies here. People will be walking around, some people will be in a hurry while others are standing around talking to each other. It's definitely something that if you actually stop to check, you would see they're just NPCs clearly set to just wander around, but the effect is pulled off really well, just given the variety you will see at any single moment. And you'll see them a lot as the mission structures, especially in the way they're placed, are really somewhat annoying. Very often missions will have you go to the same place and coming to your home time after time, sometimes only getting a cutscene. And it gets really tedious. This of course is made worse by me having no idea what's going on in the story, but I don't think that any of the main Yakuza games did something like this. Closest I can think of is the bar New Serena in Yakuza 1 and 2, which was a place you'd return to a lot, but at least by feeling it's nothing like Kenzan. That being said, Kenzan does introduce something really nice to the series. It was the first one where you were able to send and retrieve items from the box at save points, which is a godsend to the series. Here of course there aren't phone boxes, here instead we have shrines, which make sense I guess. Soundtrack wise, I was surprised neither positively or negatively because I expected more of a traditional Japanese sound, but it's very much a Yakuza soundtrack with a very small infusion of that traditional sound, which isn't bad, but again, I feel like they could have gone way further with it. Now to end this, I want to talk about why I think this game is so bland in its production despite it having a very unique setting. This was the first PS3 Yakuza game and it came out between Yakuza 2 and 3, so in some ways this was probably a sort of test for the devs to get familiar with the PS3 system, or given the time frame this came out in, only a year before Yakuza 3, it's possible that this was being developed alongside the game, and maybe it was always meant to be a game with a much smaller scope to hold over players until Yakuza 3 released, which is common with spin-offs. Regardless though, Yakuza Kenzan is one of the weakest Yakuza games, and even with its setting, it's not the weirdest Yakuza game That's a hint for another video, by the way. While I will not be scoring this game, I will give my recommendations, and the recommendation is probably skip this one, unless you just can't go without more Yakuza content, and there is a lot of it out there. It just isn't engaging enough gameplay-wise to be worth the 9 or so hours the game will take, especially not being a Japanese speaker. Speaking of Japanese though, if you do end up deciding to play this game, I will say that I didn't use a guide, but I did look up a walkthrough at 2 specific points in the story where I didn't know where to go. One was a scene where the waypoint would just lead me to a text box that would not progress. And in that situation, I just had to get a specific amount of the currency of the game. And another one was where I was just left without a waypoint and without an obvious place to head in. And in that situation, it happened to be the center of the town area where I had to run into a scripted event. Regardless of your choice though, I hope that this video helped you in some way into the experience of playing this as a non-Japanese speaker. And well, regardless of that, please consider subscribing and liking and maybe commenting. These are all things you can do for free on YouTube, and regardless of that, goodbye.